Big welcome, Sung, for joining us. And I hope I'm getting closer with your name. I apologize. Um, I also know what that feels like because even within my family, my mom and I, we disagree all the time on how my name should be pronounced. So I'm kind of like really used to like taking any variation that's kind of close enough. But as I was saying before, and for everyone out there, it's like Hyeseung's written this fantastic memoir. I want you guys to read it, so I'm not going to like tell you everything about it, but I also want to make sure that we all have enough context so that as I ask questions, you know where this is coming from. So I apologize because this mu must feel uncomfortable, but I don't know, maybe for memoirs it doesn't. I'm gonna like try and take your memoir, which has already taken your life and condensed it and condense it yet further into some bullet points. So correct me if I'm wrong or add anything you think I've dropped out. But you were born in South Korea and your family immigrated to Texas when you were quite young. And your
Mhm.
father dreamt of making it rich. He's like a character who kind of like busted through I think he had an engineering position, but that wasn't gonna make it fast enough for him, so he kept trying all these different entrepreneurial things um, and not successfully for a big section of his life. And then at the same time, it seemed like your mom had definite kind of American, uh, um, American dreams, as it were. So you guys settled in a development called Sugar Land, which seemed to me like very much the the American dream in terms of you get to choose your house and you get to choose all the decor, etc. But it gave you this upbringing, gave you like a real sense of otherness, right? Because you were surrounded by mainly non-Korean kids who really didn't know how to take you when you turned up in class. Like one little girl asked the teacher whether you spoke English. So, and that otherness kind of follows you through the book. And as an Asian female, I'm very interested in that. So we're going to talk about that some. Um, and in the meantime, you had in an Asian family the misfortune of being very bright because now the expectations are super, super high on you. And your mother especially seems to put all her dreams into you, turns into like the stereotypical typical uh, tiger mom, or maybe even more than that, a dragon mom. And you perform for her. You go to Princeton, you go to Harvard, and it all kind of collapses in because of well, in part because of the pressures. I'm sure there are other reasons too. And so your tale is one of like several bouts of mental illness, hospitalizations, and suicide attempts. It's like very harrowing at parts, like reading your book. And then in this comes a realization of the importance of art to you, which is, as I was saying before, a great reason why I was so attracted to your memoir, as I like to dabble too. Um, and then you also talk or share with us like a good friendship is the way I would classify it, that turned into a failed marriage, right? With Nate.
Oh,
And then a late reconciliation with your family when your mom had cancer and she passed. And you kind of leave us at the end of after that reconciliation, the book ends um, when you're also a little bit more reconciled with your father and your brother, and you're kind of like, I think that you had this beautiful phrase that you were a monad, not a dyad, and you were like now making this new life. So would that be a fair encapsulation in like 16 bullet points, do you think?
thank you so much for having me, first of all, and it's really wonderful to meet you all. Sharon said that you're all mostly memoirs writers and also obviously readers of literature, so it's really an honor to be here. I love always listening to smart, sensitive readers talk about what they think my story is. It's so different from my elevator pitch which is about Docile being a story about an artist coming to be and finding visibility in the culture and in my family through academic achievement, and then like basically ignoring the call of art long enough to develop mental illness, lose anything of external worth, and find redemption in art. So yes, my agent calls Docile the Asian Girl Interrupted, if you know that book from like 31 years ago. So, and I think that's a really fitting comp, even though the comp is an old one. So, yeah, but I love the way that you painted that arc of the book. So thank you for being such a careful reader, Shirin.
Oh, well, you're welcome. So, like you said, every reading is like a duet, isn't it, in a way between
It's
author
yes,
and
it
reader.
totally. What a beautiful way of putting it. Yes.
And so my part of the duet, for me, I thought that two kind of things drove this book. One was that kind of that sense of self-estrangement, right? That you were never getting to be who you I don't think that maybe you knew who you wanted to be, but whatever it was that you were being, it wasn't it. Like this, so there's like this very strong self-estrangement, sense of self-estrangement. And
Mm.
in your case, the way that I read it was that a lot of this had to do with having to wrestle it away from your mom because she had such strong visions of who you were supposed to be. And then the other thing that I thought pushed this book, and maybe, sometimes it's not just the author and the reader, but it's also the author, the reader, and the moment. And reading your book in this particular moment in time, I thought that something that strongly drove this book was this relationship with race, with this kind of this exploration of culture and not quite fitting into culture, either your Korean culture or your family culture or the American culture around you. Um, and so, like I said, most of the readers here are also writers, and a large subset who turn out tonight are memoirists. Um, and your memoir struck me as, I mean, all memoirs are personal, but yours is very harrowing at times. And so I'm going to start with the most obvious question, which is like, what made you want to write it and share it?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, when you're talking about the two sort of thematic strands, like self-estrangement and that being related to my mother and my enmeshment with my mother, and also my racial identity, um, it's interesting. I think that really my mother, I don't characterize her as a tiger mom or dragon mom. She was very um, keen-sighted and creative, and she had a very strict moral compass, but she wasn't like a helicoptering mother. I think she was because she was so busy, and I think a lot of immigrant families are like this, where there's a lot of sort of daily distance between the child and the mother and father because the mother and father may be working outside of the home. But I knew all the time exactly what my mother wanted and needed from me. And she was so very disappointed with her own life that it was, I knew who I was, but I also knew that I wanted to pay my mother back for her sacrifices for my existence. So there's a big theme in my book about um, children as debts to their parents. And I think that enmeshment and that feeling of like self-estrangement because I had to sacrifice and pay my mother back in the ledger of love, that's a big theme. And I think the way that I did that was so easy because it's very low hanging fruit. Like you in the culture racially are expected to be a great student. So why not just do that? So that was helpful to the white culture in Texas to see me, to find that half visibility of being like a great student. And also like it was great for my parents because they felt like, okay, this is exactly what we came here to America for, to give her a good life, and that's sort of the way those two themes come to collide. I came to write my book, and it's actually, I'm very proud of the meta story, of the second order story of my book journey, because it is pretty interesting. Like my book, or it's interesting to me, maybe it's not interesting to you, but I started when I was in college, and I write about this in Docile. I was sent away from Princeton because I was having a really, really hard time. And back in the late 90s, people used the word depressed, but they didn't have an understanding, I think, in the vernacular about um, clinical depression. So, it's like, oh, I got a C on this test. I'm so depressed. People used it, but didn't really understand that it actually could mean something quite deep. And I had a conversation with the dean of my college at the time, and she sort of opened this door to me to leave Princeton and take some time off. And of course, I went to Houston, back to where I had grown up with my parents, and my parents were extremely, extremely astonished, disappointed, and just really freaked out that this, child who had stayed on a track was now off of it. And they sent me as a bootstrapping measure to Korea. And Korea was probably the worst place for me to go to at the time because whatever conversation culturally, psychologically, we were having in America at the time, Korea was much later, much more behind. And a lot of things ensue. You can read it if you read the book. A lot of things happen in Korea, some good, much bad. And I come back to um, America, and I go back to Princeton, and I have this realization, the one sort of silver lining realization that, the whole time I had grown up in America, operating under the assumption that I was a Korean in America. And then I go to Korea and I'm like, okay, finally I'm a Korean in Korea. But no, of course, even me walking down the street, people know that I am diaspora. They know that I am not from Korea. So when I'm on the plane, I come back to America, and I realize there's this third distinct separate thing, Korean American, that I am, that nobody's talking about yet. And yet I can like figure that out, what that means, that identity for myself. And the thing that happens is I immediately start writing about it. I'm writing constantly about it. So I ended up writing the first few chapters of what would become Docile when I'm 20. Like they're the first chapters where I'm talking about going to Sugarland, as you said, my father's very colorful but very driven schemes to make big money. All of that I wrote as a 20-year-old when I was in college. And so, now I'm 46. So it took a long time. I mean, obviously I was like living life and doing other things. And but those stories are, I think, you know, verbatim from that time in 1998, 1999 when I had written them. So that's how I started.
Right. And so in that case, like the motivating factor, like the what you wanted to share was this discovery of that such a thing existed as this third thing. So it was
Yeah,
because
I
because
think when
I
I
wondered, was it the was it the medical, like the mental health aspects that you wanted to share this as a warning to others, or what was it that kind of?
When you write a book for a long, long time, I think the motivation morphs over time. But I think the initial, like what I was searching for was curiosity about myself. Like, where am I? What is my place in this world? What is, and I think I was a philosophy major, so I was always thinking of what am I extrinsically and what am I intrinsically? And I wanted to know what my essential nature was. And I think that comes back to the redemptive power of art making in my book is that like anytime I was making art, whether it was painting or writing or whatever, I knew who I was
Mhm.
because I was creative. And I knew that that was my essential power and my fullness of like my fullness of self is where I came from. But I think to your point, Shirin, it's like over many, like I was living my life and I wrote about my mental health struggles. I did go to psychiatric institutions, all that. There were many, many motivations, but I think when it comes down to it, it was really just curiosity about myself and trying to figure out like what I believed and about myself and trying to hear my voice.
I have like a whole bunch of questions, and I'm not sure in what order I can ask these. So, okay, I'm gonna put a pin on the. So you want, this is why you wanted to write. You wanted to figure out who you were and to hear your own voice. Lisa, if I forget, remind me. I want to ask that question. But let's back up for a second because art, the redemptive power of art, um, so powerful in like so prominent in what you're saying now and so
Mm,
powerful at the end of your book. As a reader, I was actually kind of a little surprised that you mentioned your enjoyment of drawing as a child, right? And
yeah.
but then art gets like no real mention until we're on page 188 when you take a sculpture class.
Hmm.
And then by page 190, you say you found a purpose, which in the context of the book was a big thing because you were feeling very purposeless. And that was to use your eye to create a representation of the living instead of you have been having nightmares about interacting with the dead. So I, as a question, as an artist, wanted to know like how present that art was in those intervening years. When you were trying to be the good student and do what your mom wanted you to do, was it a case of it got left behind and got rediscovered, and then when you rediscovered it, it kind of like bloomed into your life very quickly? Or was it a case of you were doing it all the time, but not necessarily telling us about it in a book because you can't tell us everything. There's just not that many pages. So which was it?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a good question. I drew and um was pretty obsessively drawing when I was a child. And it was when I became a great student that that fell away. And I think that's a good question. Like, the school district that I went to, none of the smart kids went into art. My mother didn't allow it. So it was a hobby, and I was always drawing and continuing. And I think maybe that would have been like a really good detail because then it shows you when after 9/11 when I was taking a sculpture class, like this is me doing the thing that I always wanted to do that like my mother didn't allow because the smart kids didn't do art. It was like the burnouts and like kids who smoked weed or whatever. Like that's just the way it was when I was growing up in Texas in this small crazy place that I was living in Memorial. And I'm sure that's not true in other school districts across the country or whatever, but that's just the way it was for me. But it was always in my life, and writing was always in my life. But but it was me taking that sculpture class. And then, and I think back when I was taking the sculpture class, when I moved to New York right after college, and 9/11 happened, and I was having all of these thoughts, and this is for the people who haven't read the book yet. It was I had gotten into Harvard Law School and deferred matriculation, and I had this 1 year sort of like Rumspringa where I could live in New York, work, earn money, but I was also taking a lot of art classes, reading a lot of books, watching a lot of films, eating great food. And when I was doing all of that, it really felt so expansive. But like life, if I had written a novel, maybe I would have never gone to Harvard Law School and I would have become an artist right away. But life is much more twisty, I think, than the way a novel might work, or you might want to engineer a novel. Like I didn't go to a mental hospital just once. I went many times. And maybe if I were writing a novel, I would go into a mental hospital once, come out and be completely cured, but that wasn't what it was. So yeah, I think it would be a sexier, more satisfying story maybe if it was like I discovered sculpture and then I became a sculptor, or like I discovered painting and became a painter. But it took a lot more effort and a lot more winding roads than that. And that's the story that I wrote in the memoir.
And personally, by the way, I think that, the more rocks, the better the book. So I actually think it makes a better book that you didn't just, oh, I took a sculpting class and now it would have made more of a Hollywood movie, maybe, but it's like not, in my opinion, not the better book. But so the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, because I think that we kind of hopscotched over it, was
Mm,
so you kind of went to Korea, and Korea um like gave you the epiphany that there was like this third thing, the Korean American, which is what you were. Which is really funny. I'm going to insert a little of myself in here. I once went
mm,
backpacking through Southeast Asia. My dad is Malaysian and my mom's Chinese, and Malaysian Chinese. And so I've always identified all my life as I'm Chinese, right? I'm part of the Chinese diaspora, but I'm Chinese. And all the way through that backpacking trip, like the Thais thought I was Thai and the Indonesians thought I was Indonesian, and all the way
yeah.
through. And then I got into China and I said, I'm Chinese, and all the Chinese looked at me and went, uh-uh. You're not one of us. And they would just ask me, what's your home village? And I'd go, and that was it. You don't know your home village. You're obviously not Chinese. But anyway, I digress. But it is really funny because that was when I thought, huh, so I'm not what I have just like conveniently in my head
Yes.
put a label on it and then I don't have to think about it. But you were saying that this happened for you when you went to Korea, which is after your Princeton dean, who sounds like an amazing person, kind of gave you this third option, which was that you can actually go and take some time off. You had
Yeah.
said, I think it was in the Princeton days, that you kind of, even though you felt very othered coming into Princeton, and you and like kind of um discriminated against because you're Asian Korean,
Yeah.
that when you saw other Asian students, you kind of thought of them as the Asian invasion. You didn't want to be part of them.
Yes.
So how did that change then when you became, oh, well, actually, they're also, Asian Americans, and therefore that was my group? Or how has that kind of, how has, I know from the book how your relationship with your own race has changed, but how has it changed with other people of your or some?
Yeah. I love talking about this, and thank you for asking me. And I love, I mean, it is funny that we were just, laughing about your experience on the backpacking trip, but I think the point is like when we have our stories about ourselves, but we also have to have our stories about ourselves because we're diaspora. So like when we live in America, something like 38 to 40 different ethnicities are under the AAPI umbrella. We have to reckon with an AAPI identity, even though, um, in some parts of the world, we actually don't get along or whatever. So I did talk about this a little bit in the book where I come back to Princeton and these people that I had lumped together because of my own fear and I think just basic, ooh, can you see me?
You've gone smudgy.
Sorry. Um, just my fear and my ignorance, I end up coming back to America and having to realize that like a lot of my identity was built on tokenism. It's just like I wanted to be the only Asian person in the room because I felt diluted of my power and my voice and my visibility if there were other Asians in the room. Um, and so I learned a lot from coming and like sort of eking my way towards other Asian Americans when I came back to Princeton. But I think that the thing that is really amazing is this book came out. I sold the book during the pandemic. And during the pandemic, the reason why I started writing my book a little bit more during the pandemic was I stopped taking the subway in New York to my studio. My art studio was like three stations away from my house, and I stopped taking the subway because and I wasn't doing that much artwork because it was just felt weird to go to my studio, and there was a lot of obviously anti-AAPI violence, a lot of Asian American women around my age, maybe a little bit younger than I was. They were getting murdered. There was one who had been pushed in front of the subway car by someone who was mentally ill. So it was all another reason to kind of come together and reckon with my identity. And it wasn't, I think, but when I was coming back to Princeton back, in the late 90s after my stint in Korea, that was a gift to me. I could do this at my leisure, but during the pandemic, there was no leisure. We had to advocate for ourselves. We had to collectively come together because of what was happening in the world. And I think the silver lining, the sort of the flip side of coming together was also these like collective moments, these moments of collective joy, which I see because I've gone to so many universities and high schools to talk about my book. And also I'm a teacher to see students who in some ways they're reckoning and dealing with exactly the same things that I was dealing with when I wrote this book, when I was an adolescent, a college kid, college student, and then a young wife and all of these things. But um, they have so much more joy and understanding of their collective heritage than I did. So that's the amazing flip side. And yeah, I think that is wonderful, and I feel so proud.
Mhm. And so I think gives us a lovely segue into your actual journey towards getting published because as you
Yeah.
say in your own acknowledgments, this Asianness which felt kind of separate and that you wanted to maybe hold aside or stay apart from for a while. You had a beautiful line, which you kind of already alluded to, but in the book, it was actually when there are two Asian women in the room, they get averaged, which I thought was like such an interesting way to look at it. Um,
Yeah.
uh, well, quickly, do you feel that now? Like
No,
anymore?
I don't even care because you know why? I was giving the person who averages the power over my story and how I am seen, and I don't even care about that person anymore.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe I am still being averaged, but I don't, whoever is doing that, I don't even care,
Okay, it's not even in
Yeah.
your brain anymore. And so then you go on to find the kind of Asian Dream Team, your by which you're referring to your agent, Albert Lee.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you end up publishing with Hannah Pak, right?
Yeah.
And so how did that happen? Like how did
Yeah.
that? Oh, and
Um,
just one question, the
yeah.
question I had pinned before I get there. So and when you decided to do that, when you decided to pack up the manuscript, there must have been a moment. Most of my memoirists will have asked me or talked to me about this at some point. There is
Mhm.
this moment where you have to decide, especially if people are still alive, like,
Oh,
you
the ethics.
well, not only the ethics sounds like so cerebral, but that you don't want to hurt them. And in this case, your family is deeply in this book, and they don't look very pretty like half the time. So, so how
They
did you
don't? I didn't know that. Okay. Um,
feel about?
well, I think ethics is the right word, actually, even though it does sound cerebral, but you know, ethics is what happens in everyday life. So I think it's the right word. I'll talk to you about the publishing journey first, and then I'll
Mhm.
speak to the ethics issue. Um, so as I said, I started writing this book when I was in college, and I wrote for a really long time in fits and spurts. I'm an artist, a professional artist by trade, and I had a totally this other career as a painter and painter and teacher. And it was not until the pandemic in like 20, I was writing and sort of finding the arc. But I think back in 2015, actually when I was still married or had just separated, I had a book that I felt had a beginning, middle, and end. And it was actually a memoir and essays. And if you have read my book, Docile, it is sort of, a novelistic, chronological book. Um, but the first iteration, it was very different. It was like a memoir and essays. And I remember printing it out when it was done and reading it. And I was like, I don't even want to read this. This is so convoluted. I didn't even know how to talk about what it was. I think the high level idea about that book or that iteration of the book was it is how I solved the problem of myself, like what I was curious about. And it sort of goes back to your original question, Sharon, about like the motivation for writing. So it was like, oh, I was like a great wife, a great daughter, a great student. So each chapter was sort of a different attempt at like understanding and solving myself. So I left that aside because I didn't think it was like a great book. I left it aside and life happened. A lot of things happen, and I won't give it away, but something big happens in my life that you could read about in the book. And after this, I realized that the original iteration of the manuscript, how I had devised telling this story was very flawed. So I revised it. I was revising it during the pandemic. And I think because I didn't have much of a community during that time, like a writer's community, I didn't do a particularly good job. Like I didn't have a Shirin, type of person, mentor person. And I remember I just started like reading about querying, and I did it in a very stochastic, not super educated way. I think like I had a friend who was a literary agent, and she was, I think she was a literary agent for like sci-fi, but she had a publisher's marketplace login. And so she let me borrow the login for a couple of months. So I like poked around there but I wasn't doing, I wasn't doing much of the educating myself of like what the publication process should be. And now I see there's a whole ecosystem devoted just to that. And I remember like I wanted more than anything to have an Asian American like agent, maybe an Asian American, so, or even I didn't even think Asian American. I was like, maybe BIPOC, I don't know. And I remember like Albert Lee, I had seen his name on a list. I like wrote him a query. He wrote me right away. I went out with queries to like maybe 10 people, 10 agents, and they were very, I had chosen them very randomly. There was one agent that I had heard an interview of hers on NPR because she had represented somebody who had like been nominated for the National Book Award or something like that. So anyways, I like went out querying. I went very strong. Like I got a lot of like a big hit percentage back. But in my head, I was like, I want someone who gets my story. I don't want to have somebody who is going to tell me go get a sensitivity reader. I want that person to be the sensitivity reader. I want that person to get it. And Albert wrote me back and he said, send me your manuscript. And I think this was something that there's a lot of things you can learn from my journey, and most of them you can learn from my mistakes. I mean, the great things that happen, whatever, but like the mistakes, like I remember the minute that I finished the second version of my manuscript, I started querying. I didn't have any beta readers. I didn't have like a group of people who were reading my manuscript. I'm embarrassed to say my manuscript was 110,000 words. I'm embarrassed to say that, but that's what it was because I didn't do a good job educating myself. So anyways, Albert read the whole thing in 6 hours and came back and he said, I would love to represent you. And I told the other people, I think in a lot of ways, what you're supposed to do is sort of like play other agents off of each other and say like you have an offer, so you go back to the other agents. But I was like, Albert was it for me because he was Korean American, which was like, just bonkers to me that there was a Korean American agent who was willing to represent my interests and my art. And Shirin, is this okay? I can tell you like how I went on sub, and is it okay to continue?
Yeah, continue.
Okay. Yeah. So I just tell my story. So anyways, I think in May of 2021, it was like the end of May, Albert and I connected, and all of this, the agenting querying part happened really fast. Like I think I was writing query letters, and I recently looked at my query letter and I was like, okay, this is not totally different from my book. It was great. Like the query letter was effective. So it was great. But I ended up talking to Albert and he was like, listen, I want to go on sub, but let's write a proposal. And I had never heard of what a proposal was. And he said, like, I don't, looking back, I realized that Albert didn't want to, very intelligently, not want to spend like a year or whatever massaging 110,000 word manuscript. He was like, let's write a proposal. And I said, what's that? And he said, I want you to basically, clean up some some chapters, write a synopsis, and then we'll do like a short, bio that sounds really good. And then we'll staple it together, digitally staple it together and we'll send it off. And so basically my proposal, we spent June and half of July of that summer working on my proposal. I did, I think, maybe like 30 pages or 20 pages of the actual manuscript, the parts of the manuscript that were very like very polished. And then there was a chapter synopses, and then I had my bio. And my bio was different because like I have a great bio for art, but I had no bio for writing because I'm not, I didn't have that. And then he wrote the most incredible sort of subletter that I could have ever imagined. It was just, and then we talked about comps, and during that time, Crying in H Mart was doing so well. And I don't think of my book as so much like a Crying in H Mart book, but I think because it was a Korean American writer, she was also an artist. She's a musician, but she was also an artist. There's a big mother-daughter relationship in that book. She goes back to Korea. There was so much, so many parallels, and it was, the number one thing was it was doing so well. So, the subletter went like that. And I was teaching it during the time, I was teaching painting at the time, and I remember we finished in mid-July, and Albert was like, listen, nothing happens in the publishing world in New York City in August, which is totally true. Everybody sort of shuts down. And I was teaching, and I remember it was the Monday, or no, the Tuesday after the Monday of Labor Day in September. And I went and I had my first class, and my class, and he like texted me, Albert had texted me, he was like, I'm gonna, push this out at like, like 10 o'clock or 9:30 or something. I was like, okay. And my class was like 10 to 11:45 or something like that. And I came out at like 12, and there had been a missed call from him. And he was like, Simon and Schuster saw it and they want to have a phone call with you. And it just everything happened so fast. And there were other people, other houses that were interested. And I had the call, and Hannah was Korean American. It's just like, this is my dream come true, that I just a dream that I never thought would ever come to fruition. It just felt really wonderful and felt really right. And then we had a contract. It takes a long time to write and sign and work out the deal points of the contract. And so I don't think I ended up actually doing anything until the next year, because it just took a little bit of time. And then, yeah, it was great. I know, Patricia, you like that, right? Yeah, he's awesome.
I would say that's more than great. And so big congratulations. It must have been.
Thank you. It was awesome. And like
Yeah.
I owe it all to him. And
But
I think
at what point, though, let's come back to this 110,000 words ago. At what point did someone say, love the book, but not 110,000 words? So you had a proposal set. So now did you edit to that proposal, and is that how it slimmed down, or what happened there? And was that
no, you know
was
what?
that
The editing part from 110,000 to whatever it is, like 68,000, it wasn't the word count. Like a lot of things, like there were like just big chunks that didn't need to be there. And like even before I gave the first pass to Hannah, I slimmed it down a lot by
okay.
myself, because I really didn't give myself an opportunity, because I was just like, I'm so old, and not that I was thinking that I was so old, but you know what I mean? It's like, I've been working on this for so long, I just want to get it out, So, which I think not that anyone's asking me my advice, but I actually think that's not good. Like, you only debut once, so you got to take it seriously. And I think I just didn't educate myself. And so everybody here is doing absolutely the right thing to educate themselves about how to do this crazy process. I don't even use the word crazy much, but it is crazy. But anyway, so I ended up, the first time before I gave the manuscript over to Hannah, I had already kind of massaged it down. And then
And
it was interesting.
did you actually lose any chunks in the proposal and the synopsis writing? Because I often find that, that's a great time to suddenly realize, oh, it doesn't fit anywhere in the synopsis. Maybe it doesn't fit in the book.
Yeah.
That
Yeah, I think so. I think the synopsis was really great. The thing that helped me the most in the end, because I did sort of two batches of editing. The first batch was, they call it developmental editing, and that's sort of what is the actual
Mhm.
what's the actual story and what are the characters doing and all of that stuff. And I just think the one note, I mean, Hannah was really good. She said there was only one note, and the one note is, when I read the proposal, I thought this book was a lot about your dad, but it's the heartbeat of the book is your mother. And that's absolutely true. And I think the reason
Oh,
why she thought that was because the synopsis, or sorry, the proposal, the actual chapters that I gave to her instead of the synopsis, the actual chapters, a lot of them were like my dad,
mhm,
because
mhm,
the beginning of the book, like the reason we're in America is really like my dad.
mhm,
And
mhm.
um then the second batch of editing is not developmental, it's sort of more like,
Line.
sort of just the
Yeah.
actual like classic editing, copy editing, and line level editing. And actually that, like, Hannah and I were a little bit like, that was a little bit more challenging because she and I didn't see, we had different like visions about like what was happening on the line level. But in the end, like, Albert, again, Patricia, Albert is awesome. He was just like, you know what? Um, this is art. You have to stick your line and, stand your ground and do what makes the most sense for you as an artist. And that was really good. It was really good advice. And
Wow. That's amazing advice. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's really good advice, because you think that's what every agent is going to tell you, but actually I don't know if every agent's going to tell you that, because there's so much pressure to succumb to what the editor and the imprint wants you to do, because you're like a baby debut author. And
Right. Right.
but
Yeah.
yeah, Albert
Those
was
actually
always,
very, very ethical and courageous stance for him to take.
yes.
And,
Oh,
and
and oh,
it,
and on that note, I wanted to address your last point about the ethics. Like, when my book came out about a year in advance, like I knew like the last major iteration, like I hadn't done copy edits, which happened with a different team, but when my major like edits had gone through,
mhm,
and there was a sign of when the season of when I was going to publish in was coming out,
mhm,
um, I sent my, like, the pages that my brother was in, I sent them to him, and everybody who wanted to stay in good contact with.
mhm.
And I talked to my dad, and I
Was this like the first that they knew about it, or did they know about it, but here's the actual stuff, or where were
yes, they knew I had written and sold the book, and that the family was really in it.
right?
Um and my brother at that time, I mean, I won't go too much into it because um it's sort of out of the four corners of the book anyways, but like he and I, um he had become estranged from our family anyways, so it didn't go well. All my friends who were in the book, I told them, listen, this is my perspective. Like, if you have something that is absolutely like factually, like I said, it's a Tuesday, but it was a Wednesday. Like I will change that. But really, this is not for you to chime in. It's for you to process anything that you have to process, speak to me about it, and before the book comes out, basically. That's those were the parameters. Which I think that is like pretty generous. Like I don't think you have, this is your story. I don't think you have to ask permission from anybody, obviously, right? We're all on that same page, but I also think, you want to have a good relationship with people still. And if you want to do that, then maybe show them the pages and process with them. And nobody really cared. My brother was the only one who was sort of like, but I think that was bigger than the book. We were having issues before that. And my dad never read the book. And my dad died like right after the book came out, like 2 weeks after the book. So that was really hard for me because I wrote this intensely vulnerable book from my point of view. And then my dad died, and then I went on book tour, and the whole time I felt like I was like breathing out loud. And as someone, and I'll just say something very briefly, I think, the point is I felt like I was trying to talk about my perspective, and I had to let the line go slack between my dad and me. But then when death happens, you feel like the line being slack was not right either. So there's some complicated feelings for sure about it.
Right. And so I think that it's like the second part of that question. First is like the ethics and how you deal with telling your story while there are other people around who might have different perspectives or who might have the same perspective, but really kind of like not want to be seen in that light, whether it's fair or not. And then the other one is just like the one of privacy. So as a memoir writer, I'm going to imagine, I'm not a memoir writer, so I don't know, but I'm going to imagine that when you do your book tour and when you get interviewed, as you are tonight, because because you shared your life with us, right? There's kind of a expectation that maybe we can delve deeper. And how was that for you when you got published? Like, did you find it easy to put boundaries around this, or did you all of a sudden, like you said, you're in a grieving moment, did you just feel like you were more on stage and more exposed than maybe you had anticipated, or did it all go exactly the way you had expected and that was fine with you?
You mean about
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 people asking questions. I think that if you put a novelist on the stage, they're asked a certain set of questions.
yeah.
They're asked about the story and the craft and the journey. But when you put a memoirist on stage, you're also asked about your life, the life that maybe wasn't in the four corners of the book, but that everyone's now curious about. So first of all, did you encounter that? Second of all, if you did, was it something that was uncomfortable for you at all? And if it was, how did you set boundaries around that? How did you manage that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I think I understood what you're asking, and thanks for that question. I think, yeah, I think you're right. There is this discrepancy between, you put the novelist up on stage and it's like, oh, your imagination, blah, blah, blah. But when it's the memoirist, it's like, oh, it's your life. I can ask whatever because you wrote about about yourself. Like you should be, as a person, an open book. But, obviously, like I wrote a book, the character that I am in the book is separate from me as the writer and the narrator, all of those things. We always talk about that. I think the hardest thing was when people ask questions. I think people are fairly like sensitive, but I think, I think after my dad died, I had a couple of people sort of, and they were writers. They weren't like sort of lay people who enjoyed reading. It was like writers, asked me like, "Oh, your dad came to America to be a billionaire. So was he a billionaire?" Because they heard my dad had passed, and they're like, "Oh, so did he pass as a billionaire?" And I feel like that was kind of a tough question to think about. I think probably just because it felt like, my dad had just died and like he was more than his dream to be a billionaire. But yeah, but I think that in larger sort of public settings, I will just say, I'm not going to go into that, and I'll use that four corners bit that I talk about. And I think that's such a good way of sort of deflecting and keeping the conversation in a container that makes sense for you. Um, One disappointment, and I don't think this is what you're really talking about, but I think, we're talking about discrepancies here and disappointments a little bit. Like a few months before my book came out, I was having a lot of insomnia. I was having a lot of like just worried about the success, commercial and critical, of the book. And I think because the political atmosphere was so terrible, and already it felt like the tide was changing. I was losing a lot of sleep. I was like wondering what this would mean for my book, which had not even come out. And there was I put a lot of pressure. Nobody did. I mean, it was just me. I was putting a lot of pressure on myself for the book to justify what I thought of as my, years and years of hard work. And I remember I was like my husband was sleeping, and I like woke him up, and I was like, I can't sleep. And he said, why can't you fall asleep? And I was like, oh, I'm just worried about the success of my book. And he like turns around and he's like, honey, you wrote a book about how your life is bigger than any external success. And then through this book, you're putting out a product. And then all you're worried about is the external success of this product that has that message. Like, don't you think there's some irony here? And I was like, oh my God, you are so smart. And it's 3 o'clock in the morning. I hate you. And I always think about that, like how my
Okay.
husband saw the the existential issue right away and put his finger on it at 3 o'clock in the morning. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I think a lot of debut, when your books come out, I hope I hope you don't go through that, but you might. And if you do, um, just remember that message from my husband at 3 a.m.
My husband's really super good about that too. So my husband's an engineer by day and a poet by night.
Wow, we're
I
using both of those brains. Yeah.
and I really envy the fact that he does not give a toss what anyone thinks of his poetry. Like I have not met anyone who cares less. He cares nothing. And so once
That's
I
awesome.
said to him, "Oh, I'm working on a novel. It's taken me 10 years now." I'm like, yeah, just like, what if it's no good? What if it's not and he just turned around and looked at me like I was the strangest, like a stranger thing. He said, "Well, didn't you write a novel?" And that was it. Well, didn't you write a novel? I was like, "Oh yeah, I did." And there's like that satisfaction, and there should be that satisfaction in having created this very difficult to create thing and having done it to the best of your ability. And and that should be like end of story. But so thank God for people who now and then chime into our lives and remind us not to get
Yes.
distracted by these other things.
Absolutely.
So
Distracted is the right word. Yeah.
I want to just ask one more thing, and then I'm going to open up to the floor because I know a lot of people have questions. And I noticed, actually, I lied, two things. I noticed that your current husband, your second husband, he gets a mention in the author's notes and the acknowledgments, but only with his
Yeah, actually, I thought about with his initial. Yeah. I was trying to give him a little privacy, but then he was like, "Why didn't you write my entire name?" And I was like, "Okay, I'm so sorry." And his name is just Chris. It's not even that difficult a name, it's not that rare a name. So I could have used Chris anyways, but it wasn't, there's no secret thing about it. It was just to give him a little privacy, but then he didn't want it. He was like, "Oh, I want to have notoriety. I want to be your Hyeseung Song's husband." So
uh,
that was sweet. Yeah.
that's very sweet. We can tell him that he's been outed in this
Yes. Right.
interview. And then my last and closing question before I open to the floor is: at one point, I believe you tell your Princeton dean, who are you still in touch with her? Yeah, she's. I think that she did. That was such a. I thought that was very admirable what she did, and but you told her that you asked her whether she knew the Yeats poem, whose name I cannot remember, but the line
The
is
Lake Island of Innisfree.
right, and that you were looking. You said to her that what you wanted was a life, a simple life in the Be Loud Glade.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a searcher for the simple life in the Be Loud Glade, and all my friends out there laughing themselves silly because they know I never get any closer, I just get busier. How has that been going for you? Are you are you closer to the Be Loud Glade, do you think? Or do you still want the Be Loud Glade?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've never been asked that question, so thank you for that. I think that my life is, I'm like just beyond, I mean, the thing that I say on my book tour all the time was I was the luckiest person in the room. I really was, and I feel still I'm in the luckiest person in the Zoom room. Like I have like a very happy life. My husband makes my life very good for me. The infrastructure of my life feels simple and set up to do art. And I know any minute there is going to be some kind of, there's always a disruption in the equilibrium. But right now, in this moment, I feel like my life is simple and as simple as it can be if you live in New York City, which is a very complex and complicated metropolis. But yeah, my life is really set up to still be curious about myself. And even if it was not as simple, I think the Bilal Glade feels very inside me too. So I can reach it when I need it. But I don't know. I feel very lucky. Thanks for that question.
Well, I'm very happy to hear that answer.
Thank
So,
you.
um, so do we have questions? Anybody? Put your hands up and no, nobody has any questions. I did like the most perfect interview ever. No, Rachel.
Rachel Hannah.
Rachel.
Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't find the raising hand thing. Um, yeah, so I first of all, I haven't read your book, but I have ordered it and I cannot wait
Oh,
to
thank
read it.
you.
It sounds incredible. Um, Also, I wrote sort of a rough draft of a memoir of my young years and it's sort of a coming of age story, if you will.
Wow.
And I've taken a few pieces and put them out there and gotten pretty good feedback on the pieces,
That's
but
awesome.
also at writing retreats have been told, a memoir these days is what you write for your children. Um,
Who said that?
because in this day and age, unless you are a celebrity, it's really that's what you do for your children. It's not for
Wow.
the average person. And so I guess I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about, obviously your story sounds really incredible, and I'm not saying my story is incredible, but at the same time, I just wonder about the room in out there for memoirs that are more about regular people, which I actually happen to, I'm not a celebrity memoir reader. It doesn't interest me as much as what an individual who isn't a celebrity might struggle with. So, anyway, just your thoughts would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for sharing what you heard. I mean, obviously, like a lot of people are saying, oh, romantasy is selling because the universe is so complex now and nobody wants to read memoir and nobody wants to read like real life stories because they're fatigued or whatever. I guess that's what everybody's hearing. And I have heard the same. Um, I think that memoirs are probably, I mean, I don't read like publishers marketplace. I'm not seeing the deals being greenlit, but I imagine it's just the bar is just higher. I think, um, when you look at a celebrity memoir, most of those celebrity memoirs are not being written by the celebrity, right? They're ghostwritten. Um, if you have a compelling story, it's not just enough to be like an unknown, like I am, and have a compelling story. You actually have to have a compelling voice or compelling way that you're actually telling the story. So it's sort of more, it's like multi-pronged, I guess. Whereas, and it's like you have to add on into that these days the marketing and publicity side, which is they want to know, are you on social media? Are you doing, do you have a platform, that dreaded P word? But my guess is that like, this is just, the pendulum is going to swing back in a different direction too, like I think about myself, my book came, I worked on it for so long. And I even think about like that first iteration when I was writing the memoir and essays, and that was in like 2015 or something. And then, it was a few years later when I started deciding, oh, I know what to do with the second iteration. Like I don't know what it would have been like if I had tried to sell my book back in 2015, like that, maybe I wouldn't have gotten, any kind of deal back then. So I think like you work, you realize this is art, you also understand that you have to sell your art and you have to make it, but like that there's a time and place. So I just think I'm just much more hopeful that the time will come again. Does that make sense?
Yes, makes sense to me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Yvonne, but everyone who's got their hands up, just so that when you take your little hand down, you kind of move around. So we find it harder to find you. So if you just keep your hand up until you finished asking your question, then take your hand down. That'd be great. Yvonne, you have a question.
Well, thank you so much. It's lovely to meet you. I know we follow each other on social.
Totally. Hey, Elon.
So great to meet you virtually. So anyways, in terms of what they say, what you need to do to sell a memoir, I guess I've done a number of it. I had a piece go viral. It was on the Modern Love podcast. I published on my, wheelhouse, adoption, childhood trauma, Asian mental health, and national outlets. So I went on submission with a great agent on the book proposal in 50 pages, and it didn't sell. So now I am going to write the entire piece and send it out. What advice would you give? Because now there's a pressure to make it as perfect as possible, and people are saying you have to make it more universal. What is the reader going to get? We've gotten enough stories of difficult mothers, mentally ill mothers. What can, I have an A and B timeline, and people said, show more of the A. The A is from finding the adoption documents. I knew I was adopted before, and then returning to Hong Kong. They say show more of me versus the B, the childhood. Your thoughts and everything.
Yvonne, when you say you're getting advice to send the whole piece out, you mean like
No,
not through the proposal?
no, I did it. We sent it on the proposal in 50 pages. It didn't sell. So I have a
Right.
great agent. So now we're going
Right.
to submit it when it's all done. We're going
Oh,
to
okay.
on the floor, submit it on the floor.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so got it. Okay. So you have like two timelines. One timeline is sort of the adoption discovery, and then the other one is like the childhood.
Yes, adoption discovery and trying to do research, interviewing family relatives, finding out my parents' own trauma in China. So it's me in the current trying to find out why my parents behaved so horribly and what led my birth mother to abandon me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about like what what your comps are because there are like, do you have a sense of
Yeah.
because I'm thinking, yeah, like Tracy O'Neill's Woman of Interest did very, very well, and that seems sort of kind of a similar touch point for you.
Right.
I'm
Okay.
just sorry,
Yeah.
I'm just asking you what
Yeah.
what you're thinking.
Yeah, Stephanie Foo's is in a way, hers is more hybrid in that she's giving advice. I don't think I'm going to give advice. I'm not going to give advice. It's more the personal narrative, the personal narrative.
I see.
Yeah.
So I don't know because but I'm gonna say this one thing
Sure.
from my experience, if that help if it's helpful, is like my book spans almost 40 years of my life, and a lot of, I think not a lot, it was two um editors both gave me kind of the same advice when they passed on my book. And
Mm,
they said they thought this was more of a coming of age
mm,
book, and that the arc that goes towards like the marriage and
mm,
like college,
mm,
like that felt like a different book to them. I actually totally disagree, which was great because they passed anyways.
mm.
But I think um if you have the A and B plots or
Mm.
whatever, I think that maybe, I could see you getting kind of similar feedback because because the timeline sounds quite long. Does
Yeah,
that make sense?
yeah, that makes sense. I know I have to work on it, but no, I appreciate your feedback. Just have to keep on keeping on. And then also,
There's a question here, going back to what you had said, Hyeseung, about when you first came out, you had not used any beta readers, or you weren't, you didn't use a dev editor, you weren't workshopping it around at all. And I'm wondering, Yvonne, how much input are you getting? Like, how much are how
I've
many
gotten
perspective are you getting?
problem. I've gotten too much input. I mean, I've been lucky. I've been to Breadloaf twice. I went to
Oh, wow.
House. I
Yeah.
went to Pen America. So I've gotten way too much input. So the problem,
Right.
I've gotten
How much
many
is
voices,
that is too
too many
little.
voices. I just have to finish it. And yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Oh, and I don't want to say, Sharon, I like people were reading bits and pieces, but nobody read like the whole entire thing.
Right.
So I don't
Right.
want to say, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just kind of. So, all right, Diana, you had a.
Yeah. Hi. I'm sorry. I'm sitting outside of a memoirist who's on tour and doing a Happy Women's Dinner here in Palo Alto that I'm late for. So I'm sorry. I was like, oh God, am I leaving? Am I leaving? I apologize. I just wanted to say thank you. This is really lovely to hear and to meet you, and so hopeful in this sphere. I think similar to maybe what Rachel you heard and Yvonne you're experiencing. I had pretty similar, a lot of enthusiastic agent interest and also some early editorial interest, and then have been on submission now since the fall. And most of the feedback, I have a great agent and everybody gets back to her, which I guess in this day and age is actually pretty positive because people ghost people now.
Yeah.
And everybody hands down has said, we're just not doing memoir for people without a big platform. We're just not doing memoir for people who aren't famous. And it's very, it's sort of depressing and just disheartening, but I feel like at some point, hopefully the pendulum will switch back. And I don't know if others, you know, have any other thoughts about this or ability to overcome maybe the market or the interest in the market. It doesn't necessarily seem to be a lack of interest or good comps or good agent or, good proposal necessarily, but it really does seem to be like this moment in time in publishing not wanting to do memoir. I don't know if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts. I think that that dreaded word platform, it's even the ground is shifting underneath us about platform, because it's not just social media, but it's even like the marketing and publicity of the product of the book. Ultimately, like with SNS, like my imprint, the flagship imprint, getting rid of blurbs, for instance, which used to be such a big part of that sort of literary ecosystem of like paying it forward, reading people's stuff, writing the blurb, putting it on the book. And now, I don't think that part of it is not completely going away, but the fact that like one big imprint of the big five is deciding not to do that, like even it's like it's like slimming down another thing that we can do to help our cause and help our commercial cause. So it just puts the onus on the writer to like learn more, react better or faster, and that's tough. And I think that's, to me the underlying advice for all of you, if I can give it, is like my experience. Like I think I did it so stochastically because I was sort of like flailing about, and it was the pandemic. I didn't have a lot of community. I was trying to do this thing. And I was also frustrated because I had been writing this for a really long time, which I'm sure a lot of you have been writing your projects for a long time too. But just the fact that you're here educating yourselves, connecting with each other, and just finding support from other writers, that's super key, because there's such a lack of transparency. Like even I don't know the answer to a lot of things that happened with my book and the imprint, because the imprint is very like they're holding a lot of that information close, because the market for the way that these imprints, the way the publishers are making money on the books, is that they're looking for like a hit, and then the hit pays for all the other books that are not hitting. And that's kind of tough, because if you're memoirs, obviously you want your book to be a hit. You want everything that you've put your blood, sweat, and tears in to like be a commercial success. But that's just not the way this industry is actually like it's not structured that way, which is bonkers, because no other industry is set up like this. But like learning about it and understanding what is happening, what tectonic shifts are happening, that is going to make you be in a better position when hopefully the pendulum swings in your favor, if that makes sense.
Right. And I would also add to that there's part of that tectonic shift right now is that, when I was teaching this publishing 10 years ago, even, my advice was so strong to people who said, oh, well, maybe I should think of self-publishing. I would be like, oh no, that's like accepting defeat, it's going to brand you for life. Don't do it. But that's not the case anymore. So for some of these books, I think that as the industry shifts and as the business model becomes for the big five, that we need these like, we make all our profit on 3 books out of a list of 300, and everybody else like falls falls away. And as certain books become less easy with that model for them to justify, because the big memoirs, I mean, with the big novels, in a way, you never know where they're going to come from, right? That's
Mm,
they can't pick them, or else they wouldn't be publishing 300 to get three. They would be publishing three to get three. But
right.
with memoir, unfortunately for me, because I write literary fiction, with literary fiction, everything is like, these books tend to sell about X number, and that X number is more and more and more just not big enough to make our model work. So I think that some of these genres are actually going to go, the readers who love them will still read them, but the way that they get into the market is liable to change. That's, and I think that the good thing about it is that there are options now for writers to get good product out there. You have to work incredibly hard and be super determined, but you can do something now that you can't do 10 years ago. So, anybody else want to end us off on like a more cheerful note?
Shirin, I want to circle back because you had a question that you put a pin in that you didn't get around to about hearing her own voice. I scribbled a note down. Is it coming back to you?
Ah,
Writing to hear your own voice and hear what you needed to say.
oh, yes, no, but I think I've already asked that in different
Okay, good.
Yeah, what I wanted to say at that point was that, you write to hear your own voice, but then for some of us, back to, me and Lewis, some of us are satisfied. Like, I heard my own voice, I've made this poem, it's a beautiful piece of art to me, and then we're done. And then there are others of us where it's not just that we want to hear our own voice, we want to have other people hear our voice. So
Yeah.
I was just wondering at what point that happened for you. Was that right from the beginning you were writing? Were you writing in the beginning? My sense is when you were in college, you were kind of writing this for yourself. You were working things out. So at what point was it like, no, I want this out there and I want other people to hear it? And
I think if you're an artist, and I really identify as an artist, you want to be in conversation. You want to make something, whether it's a painting or write your memoir, like it needs to be out there in the world and interact with the world and have its own life. That's something that is a theme in my book, is that if you create something, you have to give it life and you have to let it go and have its own existence out there in the world. And I think that happened very fast for me. Like, I think that's the difference between someone who is a hobbyist and who is actually doing this, is that there is this thirst to have it out there and have it interact and be interpreted. It was like the beginning of our conversation. You're having your own interaction with my art and with my book, like that shouldn't be mediated through me at all. So that happened very, very quickly because whatever the medium, whatever genre I'm working in, like that, I am an artist and I want my imprint out there for whatever, in the zeitgeist, in conversation with other people. That's what I want.
thanks for reminding me, Lisa.
And I just want to say, I know I'm interrupting a little bit, but I just want to say, because Shirin, you asked about ending on a hopeful note. I actually took your answer to my question as being very hopeful and feel inspired by that and by your journey. And am, as much as it's, at least for me, I can just speak for myself, so easy for me to get buried in um, the industry, because
Yeah.
that's just like a hook for the self-critic, right? That's just
Yeah.
the hook. I feel more committed after hearing you speak to the art of it and to seeing that through to the best of my ability and to the point where it feels that it sits with my heart. And
Thank you. That's
so
so
thank you.
nice. That's wonderful. And it's the challenge of the times to hold those two things separately, but in conversation, like, your art, but also the environment out, your art is going to go out into, like, holding those two sort of journeys separately is really tough, but it's also like a very activating challenge.
Very activating challenge.
So on that perfect note, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel.
And part of my complicated art is I just love hearing that anything good came out of this evening, and the fact that you're feeling more inspired, like, ticks that box. Good job, Danielle. Pat on the back. And we've had a successful evening. So thank you so much, Hyeseung, for your part in it. It was like wonderful to talk. It was wonderful to read your book and wonderful to talk to you about it. And
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for being so open and so patient with our questions. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah, and we had so actually I'm gonna end on this note. We had said earlier, like, I had asked you whether this was, a lot of memoirs like write only once, but no, you said this is the beginning of your writing career. So do you want to tell us about, yeah, and you don't have to, because I also know some artists don't like to share too early, but tell us what you're working on writing wise. Yeah.
Yeah, I was telling Shirin, I am writing a book and I'm sort of in the woods right now in a state of neither knowing what I'm writing or knowing where it's going. And I think that's a very fecund state to be in because I mean, it's frustrating, but it's also like I know I'm going to get out of the woods at some point, and it's not forever. But I think in some ways it's really like a continuation of the same themes. Like, the book is a lot about grief and the power of art making and a lot of chaos, mental health chaos. So I'm very proud of the 20,000 words that I've written so far. They're really interesting, and I think they're bending the language in a way that I hadn't done before. So that's been very exciting, but I don't know. There's no elevator pitch about the book yet. So,
Well, best of luck with it. And everybody, can you put your mics back on, and let's give Hyeseung a big round of applause.
oh,
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
thank you.
Thank you very
you.
much. Good night, and please stay in touch.
It's a great book. I'm reading your book. I love it.
Oh, wow. Thank
Your
you so
language is
much.
beautiful,
Thanks,
and all of you are going to really like it. Thank you for telling
thanks,
your story.
Valerie. Oh, thank you.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.